Chapter 6. Explanatory Ore. How explanation became objective, yielding the material to forge an iron rule that says the same thing to every scientist, the iron rule's first innovation. There is an undiscovered island somewhere in the southern oceans, a scrap of land whose people have yet to make contact with the modern world. Call it Atlantis. If it does not exist, invent it. It is needed for philosophical purposes. The Atlanteans, though few in number, have a scintillating civilization. Poets, architects, playwrights, and mathematicians mill about their court and their marketplaces, along with natural philosophers who aim to understand the workings of the visible world, the planets, light, falling objects, living things. But like the ancient Greeks, or the Ming Dynasty Chinese, or the Elizabethan English, the Atlanteans lack modern science. After one navigational error too many, you find yourself washed up on the Atlantean shores. Your hosts are thrilled and perplexed by their mysterious visitor. You tell them about vaccines, antibiotics, and laparoscopic surgery. You show them your smartphone, a remarkable object, though the signal strength is questionable. You describe a world of effortlessly abundant food, half-mile-high towers, and flying machines. Better still, a world that understands the true nature of light, the principles that move the planets, and the code that programs life. The Atlanteans want it all. Can you perhaps teach them to do science? Why not? It will help pass the time. The Atlanteans bring out their natural philosophers, eager pupils in the inaugural session of your first seminar, Introduction to Modern Science. Day 1. The Iron Rule. There is no need to persuade the Atlantean philosophers that they should search for theories of great explanatory power. They've been doing exactly that for centuries. What's news is that exploiting this insight to make scientific progress will depend far more heavily on exacting measurement, on painstaking laboratory toil, than on deep thought. In our tychonic world, it is by accounting for the fraction of an inch, the sliver of a degree, that the truth will make itself known. Day 2. You make an astounding discovery. The Atlanteans consider a theory to explain a fact whenever that fact rhymes with the theory. According to these instinctive poets of nature, the hypothesis that things made of earthly matter seek to find the center of the universe explains why he who topples from a lofty crag comes out much the worse, but not why straws tossed into a storm fly near and far away, since worse rhymes with universe, but away does not. What could the Atlanteans be thinking? Perhaps they imagine that the world is run according to the dictates of a great poet in the sky. This supernatural versifier has laid down certain edicts, such as things made of earthly matter seek to find the center of the universe, and ensures through direct intervention in the world that events occur only if they rhyme with the edicts. Although this is a bizarre view, it is not incomprehensible. I see, you say to the Atlanteans. Like us Northerners, you Atlanteans believe that explaining an event is a matter of finding out what made it happen. But unlike us, you believe in gods who make things happen by way of rhyming rather than gravity. No, that's not it at all, say the Atlantean philosophers. There is no celestial sonneteer. Indeed, there is nothing that makes things happen. The world simply is. But its state of being can nevertheless be understood. Its workings can be explained by grasping how it all hangs together, as a poem. For the Atlanteans, understanding the universe is a matter of literary interpretation. Bringing science to Atlantis is going to be harder than you supposed. You clear your throat. There are a few things you need to know about explanation, you say, or at least about the kind of explanation that supplies the raw material for the iron rule. Most important of all, explaining events is a matter of finding their causes, not of rhyming. You cannot discover true theories by scrutinizing word endings. The Atlantean philosophers mutter among themselves, casting occasional pitying glances in your direction. Such splendid technology, so little understanding. One speaks up. No, I'm afraid it is your theories that must be incorrect. Who are the teachers and who is the pupil? If only you could open your eyes and, the real world. Electric lighting, anesthesia, and broadband internet. It was all a dark fantasy, wasn't it? It is not so far from the truth. contend the many historians of science who look back in time and see an archipelago of ideas about understanding, a chain of cultural islands stretching over the centuries, each with a proprietary and parochial concept of what it is for a theory to provide an adequate explanation of patterns of everyday events and experimental outcomes. Each era has its own rules for making sense of the world. There are, writes the contemporary historian Peter Deer, no timeless, ahistorical criteria for determining what will count as satisfactory to the understanding. Cast your mind back to Thomas Kuhn, early in his career, attempting to comprehend Aristotle's physics. He encountered some peculiar ideas. Aristotle regarded an object's location in space as though it were a property like colour. Moving, then, is a bit like changing colour. As a consequence, there cannot be an empty location in space. Locations are properties of things, so where there is a location, there is a thing, in the same way that where there is a colour, there has to be a thing to bear that colour. In fact, according to Aristotle, there is no such thing as space. There are only places, and they are all filled. He was perhaps the first theorist of inner-city parking. Further, characteristic patterns of motion, such as heavy things' tendency to fall to earth, are given an explanation that seems biological or even psychological. The natural end state for the heavier varieties of inert matter is to occupy the exact midpoint of the universe. All things, animal, vegetable, and mineral, seek out their natural states. Thus, inert matter heads directly for the center of the world, which is also the center of the earth. None of this at first made any sense to Kuhn. Aristotle's claims seemed so obscure as to be unintelligible. Then he looked out the window and everything, as he said, fell into place. He achieved the ability to see the world as Aristotle did, to operate with Aristotelian principles for explaining the world, principles that were so strange as to be almost Atlantean. Now I could understand why Aristotle had said what he'd said. That experience inspired Kuhn's conception of scientific progress as a series of leaps from framework to framework, with each such paradigm shift bringing a new explanatory system that mystifies scientists educated in an older way of looking at the world. A paradigm is more than an explanatory framework. It is a complete recipe for doing science, including goals and methods, as well as modes of understanding. Modern historians are skeptical, as you saw earlier, that scientists' behavior conforms to any schema as totalizing as a Kuhnian paradigm. But, like Peter Deer, many hold on to the explanatory component of Kuhn's picture even as they discard the rest, endorsing along with Kuhn an idea that might be called explanatory relativism. The thesis of explanatory relativism says that each age or school has its own standards for explanation and understanding, and that one age's standards typically make little or no sense to the thinkers of another age. In this formulation, make no sense to does not mean merely appear implausible to. It means that explanations from another time do not seem to be explanatory at all, just as we consider the Atlanteans' rhyming scheme to be, however beautiful, quite incapable of conveying true understanding of why things happen. Untimely explanations, then, are off the table altogether, disqualified from inquiry before the game begins. Only a skilled historical interpreter, as Kuhn took himself to be, can appreciate their virtues, and even then perhaps only by way of some unbidden, almost mystical epiphany. If the thesis of explanatory relativism is correct, then there can be no consensus over time about different theories' comparative explanatory success, since success means something completely different for each theory. In that case, there would be no way to establish the sort of procedural consensus that, I have argued, turns the crank of the knowledge machine. Explanatory relativism is therefore incompatible with the iron rule. Were it to be true, modern science could not exist. It once was true, but then, during the scientific revolution, it was deposed. This chapter will explain how relativism undermines consensus and how it came itself to be undermined, clearing the way for a new form of inquiry governed by the Iron Rule. It is the 4th century BCE. You are wandering an island less fictional than Atlantis, ancient Greek Lesbos, in the company of Aristotle himself, observing the diverse aquatic life in its lagoon. In the 340s BCE, The great philosopher spent a number of years on Lesbos and in the nearby mainland city of Assos, researching his treatises on biology. There is a great deal on which the two of you might, by close and regular observation, come to agree. That some fish make grunting or piping noises, that male octopuses have a specialized tentacle for copulation, that dolphins do not lay eggs but rather give birth to live young, that the lagoon is rich in oysters, and that in winter many of its fish migrate into the warmer open sea. You might dissect a cuttlefish together, as we know Aristotle did, and find that the intestinal tract runs from the mouth to the stomach, then loops back to exit just below the head. When you come to explain the cuttlefish's anatomy and behavior, however, the common ground beneath your feet starts to shift uncertainly. What does the cuttlefish heart do? You might think that it pumps blood, but Aristotle has other ideas. The heart is the primary source of blood, but also the seat of sensation, pleasure, pain, and sense experience, and in higher animals, the organ of thought. On this matter, Aristotle was at odds with many of his contemporaries who located thought in the brain. That is a disagreement, but no different from Capulet and Montague's disagreement about the nature of heat. Surely empirical testing will decide what's correct. To help the process along, you have brought a surprise for your philosophical companion. A scalpel, dyes to accentuate cell walls and other biological boundaries, and a microscope. With the help of these newfangled instruments, you'll be able to understand the operation of a cuttlefish heart by examining the microscopic structure of its parts and figuring out how that structure, guided by the mechanical principles of physics, causes the behavior of the whole. Interesting, says Aristotle, stroking his well-tended beard, but like the ideas of those old materialists, Empedocles and Democritus, here he refers to his predecessors and rivals, now long gone, utterly implausible. He cocks a critical eyebrow. Their picture of the world was so simple and so simplistic. Everything we see, they taught, is caused by the blind laws of physics pushing around dumb matter. If they were right, we would find monstrousness and malfunction everywhere. Perhaps just by chance an occasional collection of mechanical parts would work together like an organic body, feeding and breathing and turning out little duplicates of itself, but these would be by far the exceptions among the chaos. With a sudden, uncharacteristically loose and expansive gesture, he takes in the hills, the water, the entire island. Look at all this life. See how beautifully organized it is. Every plant, every animal, every branch, every limb, every organ works carefully, regularly, precisely in its own way to thrive in its natural place in the world. It is anything but accidental. Physics alone cannot explain life. The only way to explain the cuttlefish's characteristic form and activities, he continues, is to posit a property of the organism as a whole, its psyche, often translated as soul. It is not what it sounds like. Aristotle's psyche is not an immaterial thing detachable from the animal in question. But nor is it a material part of the animal, like a leg, a brain, or a heart. It is rather something that subsists in the animal and causes it to have its overall form. The nature of the psyche is to organize things for the ultimate good of the animal. Thus the animal's parts operate so as to perform functions that, working together, cause the animal to grow, flourish, and proliferate. Every modern interpreter of the Aristotelian psyche finds in it a puzzle. It is, says Aristotle, the form of the animal in its body, which suggests that the psyche is simply the physical structure of the creature. That cannot be what Aristotle means, however, or else he is no better off than the materialists he criticizes, attributing the viability and efficiency of organisms to the fact that they happen by chance to have the ideal physical organization for the job. At the same time, it seems, the psyche is not something above and beyond the body. It is the physical form of the body, yet it also explains and sustains that form. Reach for an understanding of the psyche, and it flits away into the depths. It will not be captured by a mind like yours. That is the characteristic symptom of explanatory relativism. The only intelligible explanation of life for Aristotle is to you unintelligible, barely better than the works of the explanatory poets of Atlantis, who sit in their libraries pondering rhymes for cuttlefish. So there stand two figures at odds on the shores of the lagoon, you with your microscope, and Aristotle with his conception of natural order. You want to use your microscope to settle your differences. It will reveal a physical structure in cuttlefish tissue that is indiscernible to the naked eye, you say, yielding invaluable clues about the workings of the heart and other organs. Futile, responds Aristotle. It is not that physical structure has no role to play in bodily functions, although Aristotle does in fact deny that organic tissue has microscopic structure. It is rather that physical structure is not at all the right kind of thing to account for biological function. Even if it were to explain how a cuttlefish moves, it could not explain why the movement is tuned so finely to promote life. Only Suke can do that. In Aristotle's eyes, your program of inquiry, slicing cuttlefish parts into finer and finer pieces to hold up to the light, is not sophisticated science, but plain butchery. Aristotle's program, meanwhile, looks not much better from the perspective of your own explanatory commitments. How can you detect a suke and probe its properties and operations? Or more exactly, since it is easy to detect the physical form in which the suke inheres, how can you detect and measure the explanatory aspect of the suke that goes beyond mere physical form? To Aristotle, the answer is obvious. The appearances and activities of every organism are explained by its suke. So evidence for the nature of the suke is anywhere that a biologist might care to look. To you, with a different notion of biological explanation, that sounds not so much like empirical inquiry as an exercise in begging the question. A disagreement about explanatory systems thereby leads to intellectual impasse. For Aristotle, the microscope is no more useful for biology than for astronomy. What it might detect, if anything, can be seen in advance to lack the power to explain life. For you, the explanatory power of the suke is a mystery. You'd like to use your instruments to get an independent grip on the thing, but the only way to map its structure is through its explanatory ramifications, which are precisely what to you are so obscure. By fomenting communication breakdowns of this sort, explanatory relativism presents an insuperable obstacle to the kind of procedural consensus essential for modern science, a consensus that assures scientists they are all playing the same game, freeing them from endless debates about the explanatory rules and so directing every last flicker of their investigative ardor toward observation and experimentation. The iron rule, therefore, outlaws relativism, cutting off all such disagreements by providing a fixed conception of explanatory power to which all scientists must subscribe, modern science's first great innovation. Because scientists agree on what can explain what, they agree on how to go about testing any hypothesis, even a hypothesis couched in esoteric or controversial terms such as suke, entropy, or the obscure terminology of quantum mechanics. The explanatory accord was hard won. To see how it came about, we will have to leave Aristotle on Lesbos and travel to northwestern Europe 2,000 years later. There we will entertain the ideas of two superlative thinkers. One was the last of the great natural philosophers, devising theories of matter and its behavior that conformed to an idiosyncratic, metaphysically regulated scheme of explanation yoked to the zeitgeist. The other destroyed these theories and, in so doing, shattered the dominion of philosophy over scientific explanation and overthrew explanatory relativism itself. The arc curving from the one intellectual life to the other is the story of the smelting of the new explanatory iron. In 1618, as Francis Bacon worked on the manuscript of his new organon, a young French student turned his back on law school and joined the Dutch army just as war erupted on the other side of Europe in Bohemia. Within a year, he had left the Dutch and joined the allied forces of Maximilian of Bavaria, a decision that took him to the German states that made up the bulk of the Holy Roman Empire. There, most of the fighting and most of the dying in this devastating conflict would take place. By its end, the 30 Years' War would have killed nearly half of the population in Bavaria, a third in Bohemia, and at least a fifth of the people of Central Europe as a whole, a greater percentage than any other European war in history to this day. In the dull and peaceful months before the German princes were drawn into the struggle, the French soldier found himself at a loose end while billeting in the city of Ulm, on the Danube, in what is now southern Germany. It was November, he was cold. He shut himself into a well-heated room and began to think. In the course of his cogitations, he later related, he discovered the foundations of a marvelous science. That night he dreamed 3 times. First came a dream of fear, spectres, paralysis, a blasting wind in which he could not walk upright. Second came a dream of undirected power, fire and thunder. Third came a dream of books and learning, of the beginning of a journey, of the unity of all knowledge. In the following days he resolved to devote his life to building his marvellous new science. René Descartes became a philosopher. In short order, Descartes left the army and so left the war. He lived as a recluse in France and the Netherlands for the next 3 decades, while Europe chewed itself up around him. In his solitude he wrote about mathematics, physics, philosophy, God, vision, thought, and, in the end, the passions of the soul. He explained depth perception, the refraction of light, and the nature of the rainbow, and he pioneered the use of what we now call Cartesian coordinates in mathematics. Cartesian means proposed or invented by Descartes. What was perhaps his grandest and most ambitious project, however, was also one of his first, a description of the structure of the universe, which he finished in 1633. Descartes called this book The World. All the activity that makes up the world, proposed Descartes, from the simple orbits of the heavenly bodies to the intricate functioning of the human body, is the movements of chunks of matter, and these chunks interact in one way only, by direct contact, or in other words, by pushing each other around. The planets may look like they are out there, hurtling through empty space, but it can't be so. If something moves, it is because something else forces it to move, and the sole way to transmit such a force is direct physical contact. The planets maintain their orbits around the Sun, Descartes hypothesized, because what appears to us to be empty space is full of imperceptibly tiny particles that are themselves revolving around the Sun, carrying the planets with them. The universe, Descartes ventured, is packed with giant globules of matter rotating in this way. At the center of each is a sun around which its own proprietary planets revolve. To us, these suns are the distant stars. Figure 6.3. Gravity on Earth, since it is a matter of force, must also be caused by something in direct contact with the bodies that experience gravitation. Descartes dreamed up the following intricate story. All bodies, he reasoned, have a tendency to fly away from the Earth by a kind of centrifugal force. Because air particles are more agitated than the particles of which heavy objects, such as rocks and humans, are composed, their centrifugal tendency is more powerful. Your body is trying to fly away into the sky, but the air around you is trying even harder. Consequently, if you are not on solid ground, the air below rushes up past you, pushing you down into the space that it previously occupied. You fall, then, because the air is pushing you downward, and this downward pressure is greater than your body's tendency to move upward. The same mechanism keeps you from rising in the first place. It is as though you are in a crowd shoving your way toward the exit to escape a fire, but because the other members of the crowd are stronger and more determined than you, they elbow their way past, keeping you firmly in place, clamped to the ground. The Cartesian explanation of gravity is ingenious but baroque, and indeed rather awkward. If the awkwardness embarrassed Descartes, he didn't show it. Perhaps that was because he regarded his collision-driven physics as far more than a plausible empirical proposal. It had to be true, he believed, because he could prove that the world couldn't possibly work in any other way. His demonstration was not scientific in our modern sense, but rather philosophical and theological. It began with a metaphysical argument. Space, he claimed, is by its very nature extended, that is, spread out. Empty space would therefore be an extended nothing, but nothingness cannot possess any extension. It follows that there can be no empty space. Space is necessarily filled with matter, as Aristotle too maintained. Indeed, in some sense, according to Descartes, matter and space are one and the same thing, described in 2 different ways. It is no less impossible that there be a space that is empty, he wrote, than that there be a mountain without a valley. If space is completely packed, you might think nothing could ever get started. But when God created the universe, said Descartes, turning from philosophy to theology, he set all its matter in motion, creating the great spinning globules pictured in figure 6.3. From that point on, things followed the principles of Cartesian physics. The matter in a globule continued to rotate around its central point unless other matter got in the way, in which case there was an impact having the power to send the colliding matter off in new directions. Because all space is filled with matter, Descartes' collisions are more like jostles and shoves than projectile impacts. I think of certain New York City subway lines at rush hour. Every departure from a steady state of motion, then, every meaningful change is caused by direct contact. This is true, needless to say, of manifest collisions such as a cannonball's crashing into a fortress wall. But with God and philosophy on his side, Descartes sought to show that change works that way for everything else as well. Gravitational attraction, for example, must somehow be a matter of our being pressed directly to the earth, even if there is no tangible sign of anything doing the pressing. Descartes therefore concocted the story in which gravity is affected by small particles pushing aside larger ones in their skyward stampede. Likewise, visual perception must be powered by collisions. Light strikes the retina, Descartes proposed, which then signals the brain by way of some intricate hydraulic machinery that pumps animal spirits around the body. Collision underlies all other bodily functions for the same reason. Of necessity, every biological process is mechanical, and every mechanism is implemented by flows of matter interacting by way of impact. The Cartesian and the Aristotelian views could hardly be more different, in their details but even more so in their fundamental explanatory principles. According to Aristotle, as we saw, each kind of matter has a natural motion. The natural motion of heavy matter, of things made of the elements, earth and water, is toward the center of the universe, that is, toward the center of the globe on which we live. The natural motion of the stars and planets, which are made of a fifth element, closer to divinity than air, fire, earth and water, is the circle. Thus, metal falls to the ground while the moon eternally orbits the earth. In both cases, they do what it is in their nature to do, unaided. Descartes explains these same motions in terms of pushes and shoves. Even the planets, set on their way by God, require the pressure of other unseen particles to keep them on their circular paths. To posit any other cause of motion, Descartes thinks, falls short of true science. Close examination of such a hypothesis, he would say, will reveal links in its proposed explanation that are no better than rhymes, pleasing to the mind, perhaps, but failing to establish a genuine explanatory connection between cause and effect. The same goes for plant and animal biology. Descartes conceives of organic bodies as machines, while for Aristotle, as we saw, organisms are distinguished from machines by their possession of a psyche, an explanatory principle that subsists in the body's physical structure and explains the regularity and purposiveness of the actions brought about within and by that structure. Descartes dismisses Aristotle's explanations as unintelligible. Aristotle would dismiss Descartes as hopeless. To each, the other's proprietary explanatory framework looks confused, empty, incomprehensible, absurd, as intellectually alien as the Atlantean rhyming scheme. Yet at the most abstract level, Descartes and Aristotle have something of great importance in common. Both call upon higher powers, most notably the power of philosophical reason, to determine what can legitimately explain the movements of matter and living things. It is this philosophizing that digs them into diametrically opposed positions. Their explanatory principles settled, their theories of physics and biology can only remain perpetually at odds. What next? If Aristotle had surveyed the intellectual battlefields of the 1600s, he would surely have exclaimed, "Not again." The atomists and other materialists, vanquished in 4th century Athens, had returned and must be fought once more. It was just as Bacon said, the same arguments going round in circles forever. And so it might have continued had not something new appeared to break the cycle and to direct the investigation of nature onto a wholly new trajectory, along which profound disagreements about explanatory standards would become quite unknown.